Saruhan's scary horror story, the criminal mind who tried to seize power and hijacking Flight 375. It started like any other Thursday, a routine domestic flight, passengers boarding with coffee in hand, carrying briefcases, family bags, travel dreams. The crew moving with practiced calm, offering polite smiles as if nothing in the world could go wrong at 35,000 feet. But what no one on Flight VASP 375 knew was that one of the men already seated among them wasn't there to reach a destination. He was there to anyone. He sat in silence for most of the trip, quiet, observant, not suspicious, just present. Until, in that final stretch between Belo Horizonte and Rio de Janeiro, something inside him clicked. A decision already made long before that moment took shape. He stood up, and in a single gesture, he pulled a .32 caliber revolver from his coat and aimed it toward the front of the aircraft. The cabin froze. Time, for a second, fractured. Some thought it was a joke. Others just couldn't process what was happening. But the voice that followed removed any doubt. Calm, clear, determined. The man announced he was taking control of the aircraft, not to reroute it for money, not to negotiate prisoners, but to crash it into Brasilia, into the Palacio do Planalto. The president of Brazil was his target. Right there, in that pressurized tube slicing across the sky, the country came one decision away from living its own version of September 11th, 13 years before the world watched planes hit towers in New York. But this story didn't unfold the way anyone expected. It wasn't just a hijacking. It was a cry of political rage, born out of a collapsing economy, a crumbling society, and a man pushed to the edge. A man who turned a Boeing 737 into a weapon of vengeance. This isn't fiction. It isn't one of those what-if scenarios. It happened. It was real. And most people have never even heard of it. Why? Because sometimes history hides the stories it finds too dangerous to remember. Over the next chapters, we'll step into that plane, into that man's mind, into the desperation that fueled the most chilling hijacking attempt Brazil has ever faced. You'll see how close we came to disaster, how political chaos can take flight literally, and how the silence that followed may be the most terrifying part of all. Now fasten your seatbelt. The descent into truth is about to begin. Brazil, 1988, a nation on the brink. To understand what happened aboard Flight VASP 375, you first need to understand the country it flew over, because that man didn't just stand up and hijack a plane out of madness. He stood up carrying the full weight of a country teetering between desperation and collapse. Brazil in 1988 wasn't merely in crisis, it was boiling. The military dictatorship had ended just a few years prior, leaving behind a fractured society, an economy in ruins, and a population unsure of what freedom really meant. The civilian government, led by President José Sarney, was supposed to be the bridge toward democracy, but instead, it felt like a promise betrayed. Hyperinflation was devouring the people's purchasing power. Prices changed from morning to evening. Savings disappeared overnight. Supermarkets became battlegrounds. Wages were worthless before the month even ended. A kilo of rice cost 5 cruzados in the morning and 10 in the afternoon. It wasn't just economic hardship, it was humiliation. Imagine working every day and still not being able to buy a piece of meat. Watching your children eat less while the newspapers talked about transition and democracy. Those words didn't feed your family. They didn't pay rent. They didn't stop the fear that tomorrow would be worse than today. And then came the Plano Cruzado. Government economists with cold logic and fast hands tried to freeze prices and wages to control inflation. At first, it seemed like a miracle. Then reality caught up. Shelves emptied, products vanished, businesses shut down, people rioted. Confidence in leadership evaporated. President Sarney's popularity plummeted. What began as cautious hope turned into mass disillusionment. Protests grew. Trust collapsed. Faith in the new democracy began to rot before it could even bloom. And amid all of this, the common Brazilian citizen became a pressure cooker with no release valve. That was the sky under which Flight 375 flew. That was the storm building inside the man who would later stand and aim a gun at the heart of the state. He wasn't just an angry citizen. He was the product of a national breakdown, a system that ground people down, one by one, until something snapped. He was, in his own mind, a soldier of justice, a martyr for a forgotten people. Twisted, yes, but not delusional. His anger wasn't imaginary. It was shared by millions. He just decided to act on it. This is the terrifying truth about 1988. Brazil was already bleeding when he pulled that trigger. The country was still in the process of writing its new constitution. The very document meant to enshrine democracy was still in draft while this man plotted to fly through its heart with 90 passengers on board. Think about that. The new Brazil, still being born, could have died that day before its first breath. But most of all, Brazil in 1988 was full of people who felt invisible. The government didn't see them. The economy didn't hear them. The justice system didn't protect them. And when you're ignored for long enough, you begin to believe the only way to be heard is to scream. Loud, violently. Some scream into the void, others hijack a plane. This is not an excuse. This is an autopsy, a psychological dissection of the moment when one man, born into a country that never gave him anything but disappointment, decided he would take control of something that couldn't be ignored, a Boeing 737. And that's why this story matters, because it's not just about him. It's about the silence that built him, the hijacker's mind. Before he stood up with a gun in his hand, before he threatened to turn a Boeing 737 into a missile, before he claimed he would crash straight into the Palacio do Planalto, he was just another man sitting quietly in a window seat. That's the part people never understand. Monsters rarely walk onto planes snarling. They board like everyone else, silent, polite, carrying a storm no one can see. His name was Raimundo Nonato Alves da Conceição, a mechanic. A man who earned little, owed much, and carried the weight of a collapsing country on his back. Not a soldier, not a terrorist by training, just a Brazilian pushed past his breaking point. And that's what makes his mind so unsettling, because it reminds us how thin the line is between ordinary and catastrophic. To read his psychological landscape is to walk through a maze of frustration, humiliation, and quiet rage that had been building for years. He wasn't delusional in the clinical sense. He didn't hear voices. He didn't believe he was chosen by God. He didn't think aliens were invading. No. His belief was so much simpler and far more dangerous. He believed the government had ruined his life. Raimundo had lost his savings to inflation, lost his ability to provide, lost his dignity piece by piece, month after month, wage after wage. Every paycheck felt like a cruel joke. When he opened his wallet, it felt like the government had reached inside and taken something from him again. Something invisible, something vital. And humiliation is a powerful accelerant. It corrodes quietly until one day the flame catches. When you study criminal psychology long enough, you learn that desperate men don't always want destruction. They want recognition. They want the world to feel what they feel. They want their suffering to matter. Raimundo believed obsessively that the president was to blame. That if he could strike the heart of power, if he could make the nation look at him for one single moment, he would force the country to acknowledge the misery he'd lived. It wasn't insanity. It was distorted logic sharpened by despair. He planned his hijacking like someone who had rehearsed the scene in his mind countless times. Calmly, methodically, he bought the revolver. He boarded knowing exactly where he would sit. He waited through takeoffs, landings, and hours of flight until the moment felt right. Not impulsive, intentional. That's the chilling part. Intent implies control, and control implies responsibility. Inside his mind, the decision to crash the plane wasn't an act of chaos. It was, to him, a form of justice, a sacrifice, a message written in fire and metal. He didn't see 89 innocent people sitting around him. He saw collateral caught in the gears of a larger machine. That's where radicalization begins. Not with ideology, but with the belief that your pain is so profound, it justifies the pain of others. Raimundo wasn't mentally ill, he was mentally cornered, and that distinction is crucial, because a cornered mind can become incredibly precise. Passengers later described him as cold, focused, quiet. That's exactly what a hijacker looks like when their internal narrative crystallizes into action. No nervous shaking, no shouting, just determination. A man who believes the world has stolen everything from him becomes capable of anything. What drove him was not madness. It was purpose twisted into something lethal. He didn't want money, didn't want ransom, didn't want to escape. He wanted a crash, an impact, a final violent punctuation mark on the sentence of his life. And as he walked toward the cockpit, revolver in hand, he carried the entire logic of his mind with him. If the country has destroyed me, I will destroy its heart. That was the man who hijacked Flight 375. Not a lunatic, not a monster from stories told in the dark. A man shaped by a system that pushed until something shattered, and once it shattered, there was no repairing it, only consequences. The Boeing 737-317 and the passengers of fate. Flight VASP 375 was never meant to be remembered. It wasn't famous. It didn't carry celebrities or diplomats. It wasn't part of some historical celebration or tragedy. It was just another domestic flight cutting across Brazil, making its slow descent from the north to the south, one stop at a time. Porto Velho, Cuiabá, Brasília, Goiânia, Belo Horizonte, and finally, Rio de Janeiro. Routine, predictable, forgettable, until it wasn't. The aircraft itself, a Boeing 737-317, was a workhorse, nothing glamorous. A twin-engine jetliner, compact and reliable. On that day, it carried 98 people, 90 passengers, 6 crew members, and 1 man who had no intention of landing. To most on board, the flight was nothing more than a means to an end. A business trip, a family visit, a new job, a return home. You can almost picture them. The executive adjusting his tie, the child glued to the window, the young woman flipping through a magazine, the elderly man checking his watch again and again. They weren't characters in a thriller. They were just people. That's what makes it terrifying. None of them had any idea they were passengers of fate, that their lives would be dangling between 2 possible headlines, a silent tragedy or a miracle averted. Among the crew was the captain, Fernando Murilo de Lima e Silva, an experienced pilot, calm, analytical, former Air Force. The kind of man who had seen turbulence, literal and figurative. The kind of man you wanted in the cockpit when everything went to hell. And beside him, co-pilot Salvador Evangelista, focused, skilled, trained for emergencies. But not this. No one is trained for this. Because how do you prepare for someone turning your aircraft into a weapon? As the flight progressed from its earlier stops, nothing stood out. No alarms, no incidents. The passengers settled into the rhythm of the cabin, the hum of engines, the click of seatbelts, the rustle of snack wrappers, a floating bubble of routine. No one, not even the most paranoid among them, sensed what was coming. And Raimundo sat among them, quiet, observing, waiting. In every hijacking, there's a moment where reality breaks, a fracture, the shift from normal to nightmare. But in Flight 375, the shift wasn't loud at first. No yelling, no chaos, just a man rising from his seat with a gun and a command. And suddenly, the entire aircraft became something else. Not a transport, not a sanctuary above the clouds, but a stage, a pressure cooker, a place where each second carried lives in its hands. Imagine the silence that follows the word sequestro, the confusion, the disbelief, then the sudden recognition. You're trapped in the air with a man who no longer wants to live and who may not let you live either. What runs through your mind? Family, regret, rage? Do you pray? Do you hide? Do you stare straight ahead pretending none of it is happening? That's the invisible terror of these stories. Not the moment of violence, but the hours spent in the unknown. And through that unknown, the 737 continued flying. Some passengers whispered, others froze. The flight attendants did their best to calm what couldn't be calmed. In the cockpit, Captain Murillo had a decision to make. Obey, resist, negotiate, or try the unthinkable. The aircraft became a container of possibilities, a steel capsule suspended over cities, full of beating hearts, anxious breath, unanswered questions. And still, from the outside, everything looked normal. just another plane cruising over the Brazilian sky. You wouldn't know that inside there was a man demanding a direct path to Brasilia, that he had declared war not on passengers, not even on the airline, but on the country's president himself. They were all in the middle of a plan that had only one intended outcome: destruction. But fate, as always, had plans of its own. Collision course. The plan to strike the Palacio do Planalto. It wasn't just a hijacking, it was a declaration of war, not against a nation in the conventional sense, but against what Raimundo Nonato believed that nation had become: a betrayal, a lie, a slow, grinding engine that chewed through lives like his and left nothing but humiliation and empty pockets. He didn't want escape. He didn't want ransom. He didn't want negotiations. He wanted impact, a literal one. From the moment he stepped onto flight VASP 375, his plan was clear in his mind. He would take control. He would fly the aircraft to Brasilia, and he would crash it into the Palacio do Planalto, the seat of executive power in Brazil, the very building where José Sarney, the president he blamed for all his suffering, held office. A political assassination disguised as a mid-air tragedy. To understand the gravity of what he attempted, you have to visualize it. The Palacio do Planalto is not just an architectural symbol, it is the heart of Brazil's fragile post-dictatorship democracy, a gleaming white blade of modernism stretching out beside the calm waters of the Praça dos Três Poderes. If he succeeded, he wouldn't just be taking the lives of those on board, he would ignite a crisis that could ripple through the entire political system. His weapon? A 31-ton commercial aircraft. His fuel? Rage disguised as justice. He entered the cockpit with a gun in his hand and a cold fire in his eyes, told the pilots to change course, ordered them to fly north toward Brasilia. The crew tried to stall him, pretended to agree, input alternate coordinates, tried to reason, subtly shift the scenario, stretch time. But Raimundo had rehearsed this moment over and over. His vision was surgical. He wanted the aircraft low, fast, angled. He'd studied maps, knew the layout of the capital. He imagined a direct path to the Planalto, descending like a blade through the air. He wasn't interested in being talked down. He wasn't afraid of dying. In fact, death was part of the plan, his own and everyone else's. That's what separates him from so many other hijackers. He wasn't holding the plane hostage to save his life. He was holding it hostage to end it. His logic was twisted, but methodical. He saw himself as the hand of justice. If he had been denied a dignified life, then he would die spectacularly and take the symbols of power with him. This kind of suicidal intent, when paired with a political objective, crosses into one of the most dangerous psychological profiles known in forensic literature. The mission-oriented avenger, a person who perceives their actions as not only justified, but necessary for the good of a greater truth, even if that truth only exists in their mind. He believed the world needed to watch something burn, and in that cockpit, as he barked orders, the pilots saw that truth in his eyes. He wasn't bluffing. He was completely committed. No fear, no hesitation, just a growing need to reach that final moment, to feel the aircraft descend, the structure of the Planalto in his sights, the explosive end that would scream louder than any protest sign or empty ballot. He wanted to leave a scar in the capital, one they couldn't ignore, one history would be forced to remember. But even perfect plans encounter resistance. What Raimundo hadn't counted on was the man behind the controls. Captain Fernando Murillo didn't argue. He didn't panic. He didn't obey. He calculated. He measured the seconds. He observed the man behind him, the gun, the voice, the tension in his arms, and then he did what no one expected. He began to outthink the hijacker. As the aircraft curved away from Belo Horizonte, Raimundo believed the mission was on course. But beneath his feet, inside the circuitry of that Boeing 737, something else was taking shape. The crew wasn't just flying. They were buying time, shifting angles, redrawing the map. And while Raimundo stood there imagining flames rising from the Praça dos Três Poderes, the people meant to die at his command were already trying to rewrite the ending. A direct collision was no longer inevitable, but he didn't know that. Not yet. The first 10 minutes. Shock, silence, and suspicion. The moment the revolver was drawn, reality fractured, not in a loud, dramatic burst, but in the kind of stillness that only exists between life as it was and everything that follows. The kind of stillness where time thickens and every second becomes a question that might never be answered. It began with a voice, calm, firm, terrifying in its composure. The man with the gun didn't scream. He simply announced, "This plane is no longer going to Rio, it's going to Brasilia, and it's going straight into the Palacio do Planalto." In those first few seconds, the passengers didn't know how to react. The human brain doesn't process horror instantly. It stalls. It searches for context. Is this a prank? A misunderstanding? But the weapon was real. The tension in the man's voice was real, and the silence that followed was absolute. Some passengers turned to look. Others kept their heads still, as if remaining motionless might somehow shield them from the unfolding nightmare. The cabin crew froze. Training clashed with instinct. For years they'd prepared for emergencies, turbulence, fire, medical crises. But not this. No one trains for this. Behind the closed door of the cockpit, Captain Fernando Murillo and First Officer Salvador Evangelista received the order directly. Divert the aircraft, head to Brasilia, or everyone dies. 10 minutes. That's all it took for the illusion of safety to shatter. But what those 10 minutes contained, psychologically, tactically, emotionally, would define everything that followed. Raimundo stood just behind the cockpit, revolver in hand, eyes sharp, breathing steady. He wasn't flailing, he wasn't pacing, he wasn't sweating. He was composed. That's what chilled the blood of the crew. He wasn't improvising. He had rehearsed this. For a moment, Captain Murillo considered his options. There weren't many. He could comply, follow the hijacker's demand and fly straight toward the capital, or he could resist and risk the lives of 90 people. But resistance didn't have to be open rebellion, not yet. It could start with something subtle. Stall, stretch, create uncertainty, buy time. Inside the cabin, the passengers were rapidly dividing into psychological camps. Some entered denial, whispering that this must be a misunderstanding. "He doesn't look like a killer," one woman murmured, as if killers wore uniforms. Others dropped into silent panic, muscles locked, hearts raced, thoughts scattered, and a few entered a state far more dangerous. Resignation. They believed instantly and completely that they were going to die. That emotional fragmentation, denial, panic, resignation, created a volatile atmosphere. One wrong move, one scream, one attempt at heroism, and the entire cabin could implode into chaos. Raimundo didn't need to shout. The silence did it for him. The flight attendants, frozen for the first seconds, began to move with deliberate calm. Offer water, whisper reassurances, keep the rows calm. But the look in their eyes betrayed the truth. They were just as terrified. The line between them and the passengers had disappeared. From the cockpit, the pilots communicated in low voices, passing notes on paper to avoid alarming the hijacker. Every movement mattered, every glance. Every delay had to look unintentional. At that moment, the Boeing 737 was flying normally. It was still in the air, engines humming, cabin lights glowing soft gold over a sea of paralyzed strangers. But it was no longer an aircraft. It was a bomb waiting for permission to fall. 10 minutes passed like 10 hours, and yet almost nothing had happened. No one injured, no explosion, no alarms, just a suspended terror so thick it pressed on the lungs. But beneath the surface, something was happening. Captain Murillo was beginning to read the man with the gun. He noted the language, the patterns of speech, the rigid posture, the way Raimundo used formality like a shield. This wasn't a man craving chaos. This was a man obsessed with control. That gave the pilot an idea. If Raimundo needed control, then any sign of chaos might destabilize him. The crew could use that. Offer him calm, cooperation. And slowly, surgically, begin to take pieces of control back without him noticing. Because the only way to fight a man with a gun in a sealed aircraft is not with force, it's with time, and time had just begun its countdown. Inside the cockpit, the art of negotiating with death. There are moments in aviation when the cockpit becomes a battlefield, not with firepower or chaos, but with strategy, nerve, and seconds ticking like gunshots. In the case of Flight VASP 375, the cockpit became a place where death sat just inches behind the captain's head, whispering instructions into his ear, armed and resolved. And still, the men at the controls didn't lose the plane. Captain Fernando Murillo didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue, he didn't beg. He did something far more dangerous. He stayed calm. Because in that moment, showing panic would be an invitation. Showing resistance would be a trigger. And giving in completely would be surrendering 90 lives to one man's collapsing world. So he started playing a different game, one built on reading people under pressure. He kept flying. He spoke slowly. He answered questions with just enough clarity to avoid suspicion and just enough delay to appear cooperative. The aircraft followed a route, but not the one Raimundo thought. The hijacker believed the plane was headed directly toward Brasilia. It wasn't. Murillo subtly altered the course, banking gently, adjusting altitude, rerouting the trajectory to buy space and time. The key was misdirection, not confrontation. To keep the man with the gun convinced that he was in control while slowly bleeding that control away. This wasn't bravery, it was calculation. The kind of calculation only possible from someone trained in both discipline and disaster. Murillo's military background, his years of experience, all led to this cockpit, this moment, this invisible war. Behind him, Raimundo grew increasingly focused. He stood watching, revolver drawn, monitoring every movement. The pressure inside the narrow cockpit was suffocating. No room to stretch, no space to breathe deeply. One wrong move, and a bullet would end the game. But Murillo noticed something. Raimundo wasn't impulsive. He followed a script. He repeated phrases. He used formal language. He treated the cockpit like a stage, and himself like an actor in a righteous final act. That gave Murillo the psychological window he needed. Raimundo wanted an audience, and the pilots gave him one. They nodded, responded, played the roles of the obedient crew. But behind their eyes, 1,000 variables were being calculated every second. Fuel levels, terrain, weather, air traffic, risk. Murillo's goal wasn't just to avoid Brasilia. It was to get the plane down alive. But landing wasn't simple. Raimundo had made his objective clear. He would not allow a landing unless it was directly in the capital. He wanted visibility. He wanted impact. Any deviation would be seen as betrayal, and betrayal meant death. So the pilot made another choice. He proposed technical necessity, claimed the aircraft needed to refuel, needed maintenance, needed to land before continuing. He made the absurd sound routine, the way only a calm voice can disguise desperation. Raimundo hesitated, just long enough. Murillo pushed again, quietly, confidently, a lie polished by experience. "This is standard," he said. "It's protocol." And because Raimundo saw himself as methodical, not reckless, he agreed, temporarily. It was a microscopic victory, but it cracked the door open. Meanwhile, the co-pilot, Salvador Evangelista, remained composed. He handled instruments, radio transmissions, and silent signals passed on notes. Together, they choreographed a ballet of survival, each gesture engineered to avoid suspicion and edge the plane away from catastrophe. But they were still airborne, still under threat. The man with the gun was still there, and he was watching. At any moment, he could change his mind, pull the trigger, end it all. So the pilots kept flying the razor's edge between obedience and resistance. Every spoken word was a mask, every decision a gamble. They weren't just flying a plane. They were holding a mirror up to madness, trying to reflect calm into its eyes. And still Raimundo stood, revolver ready. Not screaming, not panicking, just waiting. Waiting for the sky to bring him to the center of power. But the men in the cockpit had no intention of delivering him there. They were already planning the descent, not into Brasilia, but into the slimmest chance they had to save everyone on board. Brasilia in sight, the countdown to catastrophe. The closer the aircraft drifted toward the Federal District, the heavier the air inside that Boeing became. Even the oxygen felt thinner, as if the sky itself understood what was unfolding and recoiled from it. Brasilia, a city designed to be the heart of a new democracy, now sat unknowingly beneath a flying weapon, guided by a man who wanted to carve his pain into the nation's history. From the cockpit windows, the horizon glowed with that familiar bluish haze of the Central Plateau. To Raimundo Nonato, it was the signal that his mission was entering its final act. To Captain Murillo, it was the tightening of a noose. Every mile closer constricted their options, and one mistake could send the aircraft dropping like a stone toward the very building that symbolized the country's fragile rebirth. The hijacker stood tense behind the captain's seat, gripping the revolver like someone holding onto the last thread of their sanity. His breathing grew faster. His grip stiffened. The calm facade was cracking, not into panic but into urgency. Because for the first time since raising the gun, the target was almost within reach. He leaned forward, pressed the metal barrel lightly against the back of Murillo's shoulder. Straight ahead, no deviation. His voice was quiet but laced with a tremor of anticipation. He wasn't afraid of death. He was expecting it, embracing it. That made him infinitely more dangerous. Through the windshield, Brasilia's geometric patterns began to take shape. The straight lines, the monumental axis, the mirrored symmetry of Niemeier's designs. To most, these were architectural marvels. To Raimundo, they were coordinates, markers guiding him toward the strike point, the Palacio do Planalto, gleaming like a white blade along the plaza of the Three Powers. Murillo's mind split into parallel threads, flying the plane, reading the hijacker, measuring distances, calculating fuel, rehearsing maneuvers, planning a deception. Every thought had to be sharp, precise. Anything less could kill them all. He couldn't let the plane reach the city's airspace. Air traffic control, alerted in fragments, was scrambling behind the scenes. Military jets were being prepped. Communication lines between Brasilia, Goiânia, and Anápolis trembled with tension. The government, briefly informed, had only one instruction. The aircraft cannot hit the capital, but they couldn't shoot it down, not with 90 innocent people inside. So the responsibility rested entirely on two men in a cockpit, one holding the controls, the other holding a gun. The passengers had no idea how close they were to the point of no return. They didn't see the shifting lights of Brasilia emerging in the distance. They only felt the mood harden inside the cabin. A tightening, a dread that settled into the bones. Mothers clutched their children. Strangers held hands. Conversations died mid-breath. Some prayed. Others stared blankly ahead, suspended between fear and disbelief. It was in this fragile quiet that Murillo made his move. He slowed the aircraft. Not dramatically, just enough to distort the timing of the approach. Raimundo noticed. "Why are we slowing?" he snapped, eyes sharp like blades. Murillo answered with deliberate calm. "Air traffic restrictions. Standard procedure when entering Brasilia air corridor." A lie wrapped in the tone of a man too experienced to be questioned. Raimundo hesitated. And in hesitation, there is vulnerability. The city lights grew clearer now, scattered like constellations on the ground. The monument axis stretched like a runway of stars, but the plane wasn't aligned with it, not exactly. Murillo had angled slightly off course, just a few degrees, barely perceptible. But enough to begin pulling the aircraft toward Goiás. He wasn't flying to Brasilia, he was spiraling around it. The hijacker realized something wasn't right. His voice rose, not in rage, but in fear of losing control. And that fear made him unpredictable. "Go straight," he ordered, pushing the barrel harder into Murillo's back. "Take me to the Planalto now." But Murillo didn't move the controls. He held his course, held his nerve, held 90 lives in a steady pair of hands. And behind him, Raimundo trembled with a sick blend of anticipation and dread, because he felt the moment slipping. He felt the plan unraveling. He felt that all the pain he carried, all the humiliation, rage, desperation, was suddenly at risk of ending in nothing but a forced landing and a prison cell. The countdown had reached its final minutes, The aircraft wasn't heading into the heart of Brazil. It was dragging the hijacker into a corner he never expected, into a confrontation he couldn't anticipate, into a descent toward a runway that wasn't Brasilia's and a fate he couldn't control. The route change, the pilot's silent war for survival. In every hijacking, there comes a moment when survival depends not on strength or weapons, but on deception, on a lie so well constructed that death itself pauses to listen. For flight. VASP 375, that moment arrived the instant Captain Murillo began turning the aircraft, not toward Brasilia, but away from it. The shift was microscopic, a few degrees on the heading, masked by turbulence and the natural sway of the aircraft. To Raimundo, still drunk on the illusion of control, the sky outside looked unchanged. Clouds, night, lights flickering far below. But inside the cockpit, the deviation was everything. A rebellion, a lifeline, a razor-thin thread holding 90 people over the abyss. Murillo kept his hands steady on the controls. He spoke in the same measured tone he'd used throughout the ordeal. "Air corridor alignment," he muttered. "Standard entry procedure." A lie soaked in aviation jargon, designed to confuse a man who knew nothing about airspace regulations. It worked for a moment, but the thing about a man on the edge is simple. He can't tolerate doubt. Doubt fractures the goal he clings to. Doubt reminds him he's still human, still vulnerable. So when Raimundo leaned forward and studied the pilot's movements, suspicion flared like a match. "Are you taking me to Brasilia?" he demanded. "Yes," Murillo answered without blinking. It was the truth dressed in the skin of a lie. They were heading near Brasilia, just not into it, not toward the government's heart, not toward the Planalto. Instead, Murillo was slowly easing the jet toward Goiás, toward airports that could absorb an emergency landing without alerting the hijacker. This wasn't flying, it was chess. Every mile they covered was a new position on the board. Every adjustment to altitude was a reroute disguised as routine. Every word exchanged was a move in a silent duel where the stakes were 90 lives and the margin for error was thinner than the sheet of metal that separated cockpit from sky. The co-pilot, Salvador Evangelista, played his role with equal precision, monitoring instruments, keeping the aircraft stable, communicating in silence. When he glanced at Murillo, the look was simple. We are running out of time. Fuel was dropping, options were shrinking, and the hijacker's patience was evaporating. That's when Raimundo noticed the engines. "Why are we descending?" he barked, voice cracking. "We're supposed to be going straight." Murillo didn't flinch. He didn't breathe faster. He didn't let fear show even in his eyelids. "Air traffic instruction," he said, "holding pattern, weather conditions." More lies, more control. He had transformed the cockpit into a theater, and every sentence was a performance designed to keep death waiting in the wings. But Raimundo wasn't stupid. He pressed the revolver harder against Murillo's ribs, hard enough for the pilot to feel the cold steel burn through his uniform, hard enough to remind him that one wrong move meant 90 bodies torn apart across a field of wreckage. "You're trying to trick me," Raimundo hissed. Murillo responded with a masterstroke. He gave the hijacker half the truth. "We cannot reach Brasilia without preparing for landing. We have to approach under control." The hijacker processed this, calculated, rationalized. His mind, though unhinged by rage, still craved logic. Murillo fed it to him in small doses, enough to pacify, not enough to empower. Below them, the lights of Goiás began glimmering through the clouds. Cities sleeping under a sky that carried an airborne bomb. Hands still, most people on the ground had no idea how close they were to witnessing catastrophe. Inside the cabin, passengers whispered prayers, eyes red, hands trembling. No one knew the pilots were fighting a war the rest of the world would never see. A war fought with angles and lies, with steady breathing and unwavering hands, but the deception could not last forever. Raimundo's suspicion was swelling, his grip tightened, his breathing sharpened. He sensed the aircraft's trajectory wasn't matching the vision burning inside his mind. The closer they got to Goiás, the more his composure cracked. And in that looming fracture, the war behind the controls reached its most dangerous point. Because when a man realizes he's losing the outcome he built his death around, he becomes unpredictable, volatile, explosive, and the pilots knew it would not be long before he snapped. The gunshot, when the hijacker pulls the trigger. There's a specific sound that can split the fabric of space in a sealed aircraft. It's not an engine failing, not turbulence ripping through the airframe. It's not even the wind screaming outside at 800 kilometers per hour. It's the sharp, unfiltered crack of a handgun being fired at point-blank range, inside the cockpit. That was the moment when Flight VASP 375 stopped being a tense negotiation and became an attempted massacre. Raimundo Nonato had waited long enough. His plan was unraveling in real time. The lies he believed were obedience began to sting like betrayal. The flight path was off. The city below was not Brasilia. The glowing grid of streets did not align with the map he'd memorized. And something inside him, the final thread of restraint perhaps, snapped. He raised the revolver and fired. The sound exploded inside the cockpit like a thunderclap in a metal chamber. A flash, a vibration that seemed to tear through metal, flesh, and the oxygen itself. The bullet struck First Officer Salvador Evangelista. Blood sprayed across the cockpit. A groan escaped his lips, short, sharp, then swallowed into the chaos. The controls trembled as his body slumped. For a split second, the aircraft itself seemed to flinch. Then something extraordinary happened. Captain Murillo didn't break. He didn't scream. He didn't freeze. He didn't give in. He reached forward and flew, one hand on the yoke, one eye on the instruments, one mind locked in full command of a falling world. With his co-pilot bleeding beside him, the hijacker screaming behind him, and 90 people depending on his next move, Murillo did the only thing that made sense. He prepared to land. But landing under fire isn't like any other descent. It's not a matter of procedure. It's instinct and nerve and precision filtered through adrenaline. Raimundo now realized he had lost control. Completely. He shouted orders that no one obeyed, demanded changes in heading that no longer mattered. The bullet hadn't brought submission. It had triggered survival. In that moment, Murillo's mission shifted. No more stalling. No more careful theater. He had to bring that plane down now. But even as blood pooled beside him, the cockpit filled with something more dangerous than noise: silence. The hijacker fell quiet, not out of surrender, out of calculation. He had played his final card, and it hadn't worked. Now he stood behind a pilot who refused to die, refused to panic, refused to give him the impact he so desperately wanted. Raimundo's breathing grew erratic. He paced, he shouted, then stopped, then muttered to himself. The plan was gone. The script had been shredded, and when someone builds their death around a fantasy and that fantasy collapses, what comes next is chaos. Murillo banked the aircraft toward Goiânia. The airport, lit like a landing strip in some forgotten war movie, appeared through the clouds like salvation. But landing wouldn't be simple. Would Raimundo shoot again? Would he try to storm the controls, kill a passenger, open a cabin door mid-air? All of it was possible. Murillo had seconds to decide. So he dropped altitude fast, a controlled dive just steep enough to rattle the senses, just urgent enough to suggest that whatever came next, this was the final act. In the back, passengers clutched each other as gravity shifted. The aircraft groaned, lights flickered, someone sobbed, someone prayed. The cabin crew stayed still, paralyzed by the sound of the gunshot that had already marked one man for death. And Salvador. Salvador held on, wounded, bleeding, but not gone. His body remained beside the controls, his breath shallow, his eyes half open. He hadn't died. Not yet. That, in itself, was a miracle. But it was Murillo who kept them all alive. One hand flying the plane, one mind anticipating death, one instinct overriding every scream behind him. And the man who had wanted to become Brazil's first airborne political assassin. He had just been reduced to a threat with no strategy, a ghost in the aisle of a jetliner racing toward its final chance at survival. The miraculous landing in Goiânia. There are landings, and there are acts of defiance written in steel, smoke, and blood. What Captain Fernando Murillo accomplished in those final moments aboard Flight VASP 375 cannot be explained by training manuals or flight simulations. It was the kind of landing that separates pilots from legends and men from myths. The bullet had already been fired. The hijacker had already crossed the line. The co-pilot was bleeding beside him, and the Boeing 737 was descending fast. But this wasn't an emergency landing in the technical sense. This was a controlled confrontation with death. The aircraft, still loaded with passengers, fuel and uncertainty, had to be guided down with flawless precision, while a man with a loaded revolver wandered the aisle behind him. The city of Goiânia unfolded beneath them like a stage that had not rehearsed for this performance. The airport hadn't been warned in time. There was no military perimeter, no crisis team on standby, just a handful of confused tower personnel blinking at their radar, realizing that this plane, this unannounced bird, was coming in hot and wounded. Murillo had no time to explain, no luxury of protocol. Every second was a scream in silence. He aligned the aircraft, adjusted flaps, tuned speed, checked hydraulics, almost unconsciously. Not once did he turn around. Not once did he answer Raimundo again, because at this point he wasn't negotiating with the hijacker. He was outflying him. Passengers felt the shift in their stomachs first, that sudden weightlessness that says, "This is it." The cabin tilted, dipped, and then the nose pointed slightly down. The final descent. Inside the cockpit, Salvador Evangelista, wounded, pale, slumped, opened his eyes for a breath. He saw the instruments, the angle, the lights. He nodded, barely. Murillo gave him a glance that said everything. "We're going home." Raimundo wasn't quiet anymore. He was erratic, pacing, yelling. His world was ending, and it wasn't ending the way he wanted. The Planalto was nowhere in sight. The capital's glow had been left behind. The crash he imagined, the glorious impact, the fireball across television screens, had been replaced by landing gear dropping into place. This wasn't the finale he envisioned. This was humiliation. He stormed toward the cockpit again, waving the gun, threatening, furious, but the plane was already locked into descent. Murillo didn't flinch, not this time. If the hijacker wanted to shoot again, he'd do it knowing the captain was bringing 90 lives down safely, whether he lived or died. The runway appeared through the windshield, a long strip of salvation lit by raw luck and divine irony. No time for hesitation. Murillo flared the nose, touched rear wheels to concrete, brake, reverse thrust, metal groaning, screams. The tires gripped, the aircraft slowed, and they were down, alive, whole, breathing. One of the most dangerous political hijackings in the history of Brazil had ended without a crash, without an explosion, without a massacre, and still, the threat wasn't over. As soon as the plane came to a stop, Murillo engaged full shutdown. Engines powered down, doors sealed. He turned to check on Salvador, still alive, still fighting. The hijacker staggered, disoriented by the abrupt ending he hadn't planned for. He pointed the revolver, shouted incoherently. But the cabin had shifted. Passengers who were once frozen began to move. Flight attendants ushered children behind seats. A man in the aisle lunged. Another grabbed Raimundo's arm. The hijacker was tackled. The revolver clattered to the floor like punctuation at the end of a nightmare. By the time security forces finally arrived at the aircraft, it was already over. The passengers were alive. The crew was wounded, but standing. And the man who had set out to strike at the heart of power had landed, defeated, at a regional airport he never meant to see. In the wreckage of his own delusion. The state versus the citizen, political rage and broken systems. Raimundo Nonato Alves de Conceição didn't hijack a plane because he wanted to escape. He didn't want asylum or money or leverage. He wanted to make the state bleed. What he couldn't do through protest, he tried to do with fire and steel. His target wasn't personal. It was institutional. He wasn't hunting a man. He was aiming at the machinery of a country that, in his mind, had stolen everything. And Brazil in 1988 was the perfect storm for a man like him to emerge. He wasn't born a killer. He was made, slowly, by poverty, by silence, by humiliation. When you dissect his profile with the cold scalpel of forensic psychology, what you find is not just pathology, but systemic corrosion. A life crushed by inflation, a voice muted by bureaucracy, and dignity worn thin by decades of promises that never arrived. Raimundo was the son of a nation still trying to sew itself back together after decades of military rule. The transition to democracy had been cosmetic for many. Sani's government, desperate to stabilize a broken economy, relied on desperate tools, wage freezes, price controls, policy U-turns. And the poor, always the poor, bore the brunt. Raimundo had no political office, no microphone, no seat at any table. So he weaponized what he had, despair, and a gun. When questioned later, he would say he acted in the name of justice, that he'd had enough, that he wanted to make a statement no one could ignore. He believed that crashing the plane into the Palacio do Planalto would awaken the country, force the politicians to see what their policies had done, shake the complacency out of a society that had grown numb. But there's something even more disturbing at the core of his logic. Raimundo didn't just want revenge, he wanted meaning. To leave behind a scar large enough that it would be studied, debated, feared. That the name Raimundo Nonato would carry the weight of all the anonymous rage buried in the Brazilian streets. That he would, through destruction, become unforgettable. That's the psychological paradox of the mission-oriented criminal. He believes he is serving justice, even while he becomes the very embodiment of terror. His act was not madness, it was rational, within the twisted system of beliefs he had built over years. He wasn't a suicide bomber in the traditional sense. He was a man who decided that if he could not be heard alive, he would be heard in death. The weapon in his hand was not just a revolver, it was an indictment against government, against economics, against invisibility. This is the uncomfortable truth forensic psychiatrists must face when examining figures like him. He was a product of personal trauma, yes, but also of collective neglect. His psychological spiral wasn't nurtured in isolation. It was fertilized by media that sensationalized outrage, by political systems that rewarded corruption, and by a cultural ethos that treated men like Raimundo as disposable. Even the aftermath of the incident exposes the system's reluctance to engage. No national mourning, no urgent reform, no sweeping security overhaul. Just silence. A news cycle that moved on. A judicial process that filed him away like another madman caught before he could finish the job. But he wasn't mad, not in the clinical sense, and that's what makes his case terrifying. Because madness can be medicated, but despair spreads, it infects. It reproduces in every corner of every forgotten city, in every worker who watches his wage shrink in real time, in every citizen who watches politics turn into theater while real life rots outside. What Raimundo tried to do was unforgivable. But what created him? That remains unforgiven. In the shadow of his failed attack lies a question Brazil never answered. How many more Raimundos are out there? Waiting, simmering, watching. How many others feel that the only way to be heard is to make the entire world scream? Erased from memory, the silence around VASP 375. There are tragedies that become monuments, names that echo through generations, disasters that embed themselves into national identity like scars into skin. But Flight VASP 375, this almost catastrophe, this near assassination, this moment when a commercial airliner nearly shattered the seat of Brazil's democracy, disappeared, buried, forgotten, erased. Ask the average Brazilian today if they've heard of it, and most will shake their heads. No documentaries in prime time, no national commemoration, no public debate. A plane almost turned into a missile, a political system nearly decapitated, and the story vanished from collective memory like vapor trails over the Cerrado sky. Why? Because some events are too uncomfortable to remember. Because some truths speak too directly to the fragility of the nation, and acknowledging them would mean admitting how close everything came to crumbling. In September of 1988, just weeks before Brazil would adopt its new constitution, the supposed rebirth of its democracy. A man tried to crash a jet into the executive branch of government. He nearly succeeded. And yet, within days, the headlines quieted. The urgency dissolved. The system exhaled, relieved, and then turned the page. There were no televised hearings, no national trauma reckoning, no urgent revision of airline security, not even a formal address from the president acknowledging what nearly happened. Instead, silence. A silence that speaks. From a forensic political perspective, this is what's known as institutional suppression, the deliberate or unconscious removal of an event from the public discourse to preserve a sense of control, order, and authority. Governments, particularly those emerging from dictatorship, have an instinct to protect the image of stability at all costs. Admitting that a civilian, armed with a single revolver, boarded a domestic flight and nearly brought down the republic. That was a crack in the narrative they were building, a reminder that the transition to democracy was far from secure, that beneath the polished marble of Brasilia still pulsed the raw, unchecked rage of the people outside its walls. So, the story was sterilized. The hijacker became a case closed. The passengers disappeared back into their anonymous lives. The heroics of Captain Murillo were never fully celebrated. There was no parade, no medal ceremony broadcast nationwide. He saved 90 lives, outmaneuvered death, landed a hijacked plane with a bleeding co-pilot and a gun to his back, and was quietly thanked, then set aside. Even within the annals of aviation, the case is a ghost. It doesn't appear in textbooks. It's barely discussed in training modules. Compared to global tragedies like 9/11 or even failed plots elsewhere, VASP 375 is a blank space. And yet, it came first. 13 years before the world watched planes crash into skyscrapers, Brazil faced a dry run of airborne terrorism. The difference? It didn't end in fire. It ended in silence. But silence is dangerous, because what isn't remembered can't be learned from. And what isn't learned from is destined to repeat. The ghost of VASP 375 haunts not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. It was a warning, a dress rehearsal for disaster, and Brazil chose to pretend it never happened. For the passengers who lived through it, the trauma never left. For the crew who risked their lives, the moment defined them. For the man who pulled the trigger and failed, it was a final, furious scream into a country that had stopped listening. And for the rest of us, it should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it was swept under a rug woven with fear, politics, and the desperate need to believe that the sky was still safe. But the truth remains, floating unspoken. A single man, fueled by rage and wrapped in invisibility, almost rewrote the future of a nation. And almost no one remembers. What if it had happened? The alternate history of a national tragedy. History isn't just made by what happens, it's shaped by what almost happened. The events that hover just inches from reality, close enough to feel their heat, but far enough to leave no wound. And yet, those phantom catastrophes, the ones that nearly tore the world open, often reveal more than the ones that did. So let's go there. Let's follow Flight VASP 375 to the end Raimundo Nonato dreamed of. Let's imagine what would have happened if, instead of being deceived, delayed, and outflown by a masterful pilot, he had succeeded. The Boeing 737 descends from the clouds, its trajectory aligned with surgical precision. The passengers are screaming. Some are praying, others are frozen in place. The cockpit is chaos. There is no negotiation left. Raimundo has taken the controls. Murillo and Salvador are dead or incapacitated. The jet is moving fast, low, unstoppable. Below, Brasilia, clean, geometric, white. The Palacio do Planalto gleams under the late afternoon sun. Government aides walk the marble floors. Security guards sip coffee. Ministers prepare for their next meeting. Somewhere inside, perhaps even the president himself, unaware of the thunder approaching from above. There's no time for the Air Force to intercept. No time for evacuation. No warning. Impact. A flash of fire. Steel tears through concrete. Windows explode outward. The rotunda collapses. Within seconds, one of Brazil's most symbolic structures is torn open. Lives extinguished. Cabinet members gone. staffers buried under rubble, and the president may be killed instantly or may be gravely wounded. Either way, the command structure is decimated. The country in a single moment is leaderless. In the chaos that follows, the reaction would be swift and brutal. Military units deployed to secure the capital. Martial law declared in minutes. National broadcasts interrupted. Sirens echo through Brasilia. Airports locked down. And the image, that horrifying image, is already traveling the world. A commercial airliner turned into a weapon. Headlines explode, Brazil under attack. Presidential palace struck by hijacked plane. Domestic terrorist cripples democracy. In New York, Tokyo, London, analysts scramble to understand how this happened, how a nation recovering from military dictatorship failed to prevent an airborne suicide attack. Conspiracy theories bloom like weeds. Was it a lone madman, a political faction, foreign interference? The media frenzy is merciless. Internally, Brazil descends into paranoia and instability. The constitutional process is frozen. The public, already disillusioned, plunges into panic. Protests erupt. Storefronts are smashed. Fear spreads faster than facts. The armed forces step in, temporarily, to restore order. But temporary power has a way of lingering. The country begins to tilt backward, toward military control, toward emergency laws, toward surveillance and censorship, toward a darker version of itself. And in the middle of it all, Raimundo's name becomes legend. He's no longer just a mechanic from Maranhão. He's a symbol, to some a terrorist, to others a martyr. Extremist groups cite him. His face is painted on protest walls. Movements adopt his last words. His twisted mission, successful in destruction, begins to metastasize. The very act he believed would make the system listen instead ignites the fire that burns the system down. And Brazil. Brazil becomes the case study in every intelligence agency around the world. A warning of what can happen when economic despair, political apathy, and institutional neglect collide with just one man, one gun, and one opportunity. This is the future we avoided, barely, because of a pilot's instincts, because of a cockpit's calm, because someone refused to let the sky become a grave. But that doesn't mean we're safe. It only means we were lucky. And luck runs out. So we must ask, how close are we to the next Raimundo? How many shadows move quietly, waiting for their own opportunity to be remembered? And when it happens again, because it always does, will we be ready? The man who didn't crash into power. He wanted to be remembered, not as a martyr, not even as a murderer, but as a man who forced the nation to look in the mirror. And yet, in the aftermath of it all, Raimundo Nonato Alves da Conceição faded. Not into history, but into something more elusive, the archives of the almost. The man who didn't crash into power. He didn't bring down a government. He didn't shatter the glass columns of the Palácio do Planalto. He didn't ignite a political reckoning. What he did instead was unravel. Quietly, publicly, violently, but ultimately unsuccessfully. And that failure, that thin thread between intention and outcome, is where the true terror lives. Because Raimundo wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a monster conjured from nothing. He was a product, a symptom, a man squeezed by the very systems he wanted to destroy, crushed by economic despair, forgotten by government bureaucracy, left behind in a Brazil that was modernizing on the surface and rotting underneath. He was the face of the unseen. No military training, no international ties, just a mechanic, a citizen, a father, a man with a gun and a grudge. The kind of person we pass every day and never think twice about, until it's too late. And that's what should terrify us, because in the end, Raimundo didn't need to succeed to prove his point. He didn't have to crash that plane. The damage had already been done the moment he stood up with a weapon, and the system realized it had no defenses for someone like him. He exposed the soft underbelly of national security. He showed us how one man with a plan, and nothing left to lose, can outmaneuver an entire apparatus of governance. Not because he was brilliant, but because he was invisible. Ignored long enough to grow dangerous, dismissed until he became lethal. The type of man no one notices. until he's holding a cockpit hostage at 35,000 feet. And when it was over, when the plane was grounded and the passengers saved, and the president untouched, what did we do? We looked away. We folded the case file, buried the headlines, reduced the story to a footnote, a curiosity, a piece of obscure trivia. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was. Too important, too close, too real. And yet, in the quiet that followed, Raimundo remained. A shadow on the tarmac, a ghost in the corridor between civil rage and institutional failure. A man who didn't crash into power, but who exposed, for one terrifying moment, just how fragile that power truly was. He became a cautionary tale no one dares to tell, because telling it means admitting that the next Raimundo is already out there. Maybe he's in a small apartment, staring at unpaid bills. Maybe he's in a crowd, chanting slogans that sound just a little too desperate. Maybe he's boarding another plane right now, smiling, quiet, polite. Maybe this time, he won't fail. Raimundo Nonato didn't change the course of Brazilian history, but he illuminated it, like a flash of lightning over dark waters, brief, blinding, and unforgettable, for those who were willing to look. In the end, he didn't crash into power, but he did crash through the illusion that we are safe simply because the plane lands, and that illusion, once broken, can never fully be repaired. So we are left with a single haunting question. How many more Raimundos will it take before we stop pretending this was just a close call? Because the man who didn't crash into power may still be waiting, in someone else's mind, in someone else's future, in the next quiet flight across the sky.